Hi, folks. I wanted to share a brief update on some interesting news about New Testament history. A recent book was published by Tom Schmidt called Josephus and Jesus, New Evidence of the One Called Christ. So Josephus was a famous Jewish historian, as you probably remember. I discussed him in the previous video series on the New Testament reliability. He was born in Jerusalem around 37 AD, just 5 to 10 years after Jesus died, and he lived to be up to about 100 AD. His father was a priest, and his mother was of Hasmonean royal descent. And Josephus was not only a priest, but also an army general, and went on to meet the Roman emperor and write important books of history. Josephus mentioned Jesus in two places in his Antiquities of the Jews historical work, in Book 18, the so-called Testimonium Flavianum, and in Book 20, where he mentions the death of James, the brother of Jesus, who is called Christ. Many scholars for many decades have thought that the testimonium account has been inserted or embellished by Christians because it said that Jesus was the Christ, but Josephus was not a Christian. But Dr. Schmidt's new book gives reasons to understand this account is generally reliable, with the one likely change being that Josephus probably wrote that Jesus was called the Christ or believed to be the Christ, and that phrase got dropped in the Greek manuscripts, but is retained in the Latin and Syriac translations. You can read Schmidt's book for free online at josephusandjesus.com, or you can get the gist of it by listening to some of the interviews he's been doing recently. So see some of the links in the supplement. So here's a brief summary of his points. First, Schmidt did an analysis of the language used in the testimonium and showed that the phrases are very typical of the language Josephus used in the rest of his books. Then he looked at about 20 citations of the testimonium from other ancient Christian authors and showed that most of them did not seem to view it as being very positive about Jesus. Most of them only used it to confirm the fact that Jesus had disciples or was a teacher, not that he was resurrected or did miracles or was the Christ, for example. This led Schmidt then to study the words used by Josephus. When he compared the phrases to other places where Josephus used them, it became obvious that it was not a very positive view of Jesus. It was either neutral or slightly negative. For example, the Greek word Josephus used to talk about Jesus' miracles was paradoxa, which is not a very positive word. It implies magic or sorcery. It's the same word Josephus used to talk about Pharaoh's magicians who did fake miracles in Moses' time. Also, the word Josephus used for appeared should be translated as saying that Jesus seemed to them to be alive again, or appeared to them to be alive again, rather than he appeared to them. Next, Schmidt did a computer search of the places where Josephus used the phrase among us, and he noticed that Josephus only used it for situations where he had personal experience. Then Schmidt did an analysis of the places where Josephus used the Greek word protoi, which is translated here as first men, and he noticed that Josephus claimed to actually know many of these first men of Jerusalem, and he said in his autobiography that he was continually meeting these leaders when he was a teenager in Jerusalem. Of course, Josephus' father was from a high priest's family. So Schmidt presents many lines of evidence that the testimonium is reliable historically, except for one phrase, where the Greek manuscripts of Josephus say of Jesus that he was the Christ. Schmidt shows that although the Greek says that in the copies we have today, there's an old Latin translation from Jerome in the 4th century, which probably, and there's also a separate Syriac translation, which comes from Jacob of Edessa in the 8th century, probably, through Michael the Syrian. And both of these translations of Josephus say that Jesus was thought to be the Christ or believed to be the Christ. Schmidt shows that these two likely had independent earlier manuscripts of Josephus that they were translating from, Greek manuscripts, which had Josephus' earlier original version, showing that Jesus was called the Christ or believed to be the Christ. Then Schmidt began to research whether we could put names to any of these protoi, or first men among us, that Josephus mentioned. So Schmidt found up to 11 people who would have been probably in Jerusalem on that day, that night, when Jesus was tried and then crucified the next day, who might also have been known by Josephus. So in particular, here's a chart from Schmidt of the royal family of Herod the Great, who was ruling Judea when Jesus was born. And I added some notes here of how these rulers interacted with Jesus and the New Testament. So Herod Antipas was the one who met Jesus at his trial when Pilate sent Jesus to him. His daughter Herodias and Herodias' daughter Salome were the ones who had John the Baptist killed. King Agrippa II, Herod Agrippa, was the last Herodian king of Israel. It turns out that Josephus knew some of these people personally. So Josephus knew King Agrippa II, and there are 62 some letters that went back and forth between them. One of them, King Agrippa calls Josephus my dear friend. He talks about he's going to share some new information with them or some historical information with them. And Josephus probably also knew Agrippa's wife, Berenice. They were actually in Rome together at the same time, as well as Drusilla, who was also in Rome with Josephus at the same time. He probably also knew Salome, Herod, the son of Salome, and Aristobulus. Schmidt points out that Agrippa, too, would likely have been present when Jesus was taken to his father's house, that's Herod Antipas, because it was the Passover, and all Jewish men were supposed to return to Jerusalem and spend that Passover night with their father's family and celebrate the holiday. So Josephus was, he likely knew, well, he certainly knew Agrippa, and Agrippa was likely at his father Herod's house when Jesus was there. So he probably got to see Jesus. Then Schmidt went on to look at the high priests of the first century. So it turns out there's 4 families in Jerusalem from whom a lot of the high priests came. Here's a list of all the high priests just from Wikipedia. A lot of this is from Josephus, pretty much most of it is. And Josephus probably, or apparently, knew people from each of the families. Here is a list of the 4 main families of the high priests, and then I've kind of circled the ones that Josephus definitely knew or probably knew. And I'm just showing a few of the ones Schmidt talked about, others in the book. But the 2 high priests that Josephus definitely knew were Ananus II, the high priest around 63 AD. He was the son of the Annas or Ananias or Ananus, who was who condemned Jesus. And Josephus also knew Joshua, son of Gamaliel, high priest around 64 AD. In fact, Ananus II was one of the generals who worked closely with Josephus in Galilee in the years leading up to the final war with the Romans. And since Ananus was very old, he was Josephus' senior commander, essentially his boss in Galilee. Schmidt points out that Ananus' father, Ananus ben Seth, or Ananus I, was the one to whose house Jesus was brought during the night of his trial. And Ananus' son-in-law, the brother-in-law of Josephus' commander, Caiaphas, led the Sanhedrin trial against Jesus that night. And since the whole Sanhedrin was called together that night, and Josephus said he knew many of these first men while growing up in Jerusalem 20 years later, Josephus probably knew several of these men who were at that trial, and he would have heard firsthand accounts of what happened that night. Josephus also knew Simon, son of Gamaliel. Gamaliel was the same Pharisee, the rabbi, who taught Paul the Apostle, the grandson of Hillel, and he was probably also at the trial of Jesus because he was listed a couple weeks later as being one of the leaders of the Sanhedrin. He's also called a prince of the Sanhedrin in other works. His son Simon later also became a leader of the Sanhedrin, and that's the man that Josephus knew and worked with. And Simon was old enough that he probably would have attended Jesus' trial as well. So in conclusion, Josephus' testimonium passage is very likely to be authentic, and Josephus personally knew several people who were at Jesus' trial and were involved in accusing him to Pilate. This helps corroborate the gospel accounts and show that these things did in fact happen as the Gospels say they did. Another cool, recently discussed connection is about another one of the high priests who were sons of Ananus, named Theophilus. Shane Rosenthal is currently publishing a new book about this connection, and you can see the links for an interview he recently did on this topic. So Josephus mentioned that Theophilus, the son of Ananus I, was the high priest in Jerusalem between what we would now call 37 to 41 AD. So in 1983, archaeologists discovered this ossuary, or bone box, near Jerusalem. Ossuaries were stone boxes used to hold the bones of people after they had gone through a temporary decomposing period underground. They're kind of like our modern tombstones, but they were mostly just used during that period, that Second Temple period in Judea, in Jerusalem area, and a couple other places in Judea before Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD. They were not used very much before or after or outside that area. So this ossuary was for the bones of Joanna, or Joanna, daughter of Johanan, son of Theophilus the high priest. By the way, 2 other ossuaries have been found near Jerusalem that many scholars think are likely the people mentioned in the New Testament of Caiaphas, Joseph Caiaphas the high priest, and Alexander, son of Simon of Cyrene. So both of those people are mentioned in the New Testament, and archaeologists have now found their bone boxes. Very interesting that we can find that connection. So the only two Jewish ancient references to Theophilus the high priest are this ossuary and Josephus' notes about Theophilus. So before 1983, Josephus was the only one who mentioned Theophilus to my knowledge. Let me know if I'm wrong. And then they found this ossuary, which confirmed Josephus, that Theophilus was a high priest around that time. However, there is one other first century text from Israel that mentions both Theophilus and Joanna, and that is the Gospel of Luke, and of course Acts, same author. So here it says, Luke 1, 1-4, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all these things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. So, and then in Luke 8, talks about Joanna. Soon afterward, Jesus went on through cities and villages, proclaiming and bringing the good news of the kingdom of God. And the 12 were with him, and also some women who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities. Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out. And Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's household manager. And Susanna and many others, who provided for them out of their means. And then again in Luke 24, 9-10, returning from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna, and Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them who told these things to the apostles. By the way, this word, household manager, Chuza, Herod's household manager, it's epitropos. It's a very high term. It's the one Josephus uses about Joseph in Egypt, second in command. I believe is used about Daniel. It's basically the ruler, the vice regent, the prime minister. So it's right underneath the king. So Herod's the king, and then Chuza is a very powerful royal official, basically ruling over, governing all of Judea. And Joanna was his wife. That's what Luke tells us. So interestingly, Luke seems to highlight Joanna as a key witness of Jesus' resurrection in a chiasm in chapter 24, as noted by Shane Rosenthal and other scholars. You can see here, there's sort of a beginning and end piece there, and then it goes into the next level, and it sort of matches beginning and end, structure A, B, C, D. And then right in the middle is Joanna, so in between the two Marys, and you can see the whole structure there. So authors at that time didn't underline or use bold font or highlight, of course. Instead, they used narrative structure like chiasms or inclusios to highlight important points where the center of the chiasm highlights what's most important. So there seems to be a fascinating connection here. Luke writes to a most excellent Theophilus and highlights in a chiasm the witness of this one woman named Joanna, who's the wife of Herod's steward. But since it's a letter, Luke obviously doesn't explain who Theophilus is. But separately, Josephus recorded that Theophilus was a high priest, and there was only one such high priest named Theophilus that we're aware of in that century, the son of Ananus. And separately, archaeologists have found this ossuary showing that there was this wealthy woman named Joanna in Jerusalem at that time period, who was the granddaughter of Theophilus the high priest. So previous scholars have been confused as to why Joanna was highlighted in Luke's chiasm. A 20th century theologian named Louis Dassault wrote in 1987 that this chiasm might be an example where the center of the chiasm does not appear to have a privileged value. And then he added, but who knows? And now, sure enough, after the Joanna ossuary has been found and published, it all seems to fit together. So why was Luke writing to Theophilus the high priest? Did Theophilus become a follower of Jesus, or was he interested perhaps in Jesus, learning more about it? Luke says that many priests were following Jesus. In Acts 6, verse 7, he says it was a myriad of priests who were following Jesus. Was Joanna the same person as the woman Junia that Paul writes about? Perhaps a different spelling. Lots of fascinating questions. So we don't know what Theophilus did with the knowledge that Luke sent him. We don't know the testimony from his own granddaughter Joanna about Jesus' resurrection. But you and I will be responsible before God about how we will respond to the knowledge that has been given to us. Will we be like the priests, Ananus and Gamaliel and Caiaphas, who saw Jesus and his miracles but refused to believe in him? Will we be like Josephus or Herod, who heard lots of information about Jesus but never decided to follow him? Or will we be like Joanna, who saw Jesus' miracles and chose to follow him even at personal risk? We may or may not see Theophilus in heaven someday, but you and I are still alive, and we're able to make the choice to follow Jesus, have our sins forgiven, and end up in heaven. Please check out the supplemental links and videos on my channel for much more information, and also see the links I've listed. I encourage you to read the Gospel of Luke again and put your trust completely in Jesus. May God bless you.